So when your amp doesn't work right or whatever's going on back there, thanks JD for continuing to lead. I want to remind all of you that right after the service this morning, move that out of the way so I don't trip all over it. I know I will. Right after the service this morning, we're having our outreach meeting, which is going to be our chance to be able to talk further about our congregation and the focus that we are trying to build. There was a criticism that was levied against our church a number of years ago, and it was levied by you, actually. We did some surveys as a church called the Reveal Survey, in which you test and you explore, okay, where are we at spiritually? What are some things? And after taking 3 tests, 3 different times, the information came back that Frontline Bible Church is an insider church, which means we focus good, we do a good job at taking care of us, but we don't do a really good job of thinking bigger than us. And so some of the things that we want to continue to do, especially this year, as we look into 2020, is to amp up what we do to build bridges to the community, to those who are outside. Because I'm telling you, even my sermon today is really focused on how do we intentionally build relationships with people who don't know Christ yet and show them the true transformational work of the gospel. That's what it is. And so we're having a meeting after the service this morning at about 11:50. For those, and we've been mentioning about it, if God has put a burden on your heart to say, you know, I want us to be a part of a church that helps with this, that's going to be the focus of what are our next steps as we move forward with it. So with that in your mind, 11:50 is when we'll start and be done about 12:30. So, all right, we are continuing on. We just have 2 weeks left to go in Colossians, this week and next week, and then we're going to be done. We got missions conference, and then I start a new series after that. So this week we're looking at Christ in your job. I saw a meme, and I thought it was really good. This wasn't the exact picture, but I saw a meme, and this is what it said on there. My boss arrived at work in a brand new Lamborghini. I said, wow, that's an amazing car. He replied, if you work hard, put all your hours in, and strive for excellence, I will get another one next year. I saw that one. Just like this holy indignation was building inside of me at that moment. I mean, talk about the nerve of the boss to say that. It's all right if he thought it, but to say that. I don't know how many of you have worked for a boss that seemed to just take and not give it all. Maybe you've known of one. Maybe you've worked for a company like that. Maybe that's your current employer. Or how about for some of you, maybe you're that boss. You know, maybe you're that person that if we were to ask your employees, does this fit you? And they may say, yeah, that's my boss actually right there. It's all take and no give. So as we go through this series, okay, so we've been talking about how do you bring Christ into life. We spent Colossians 1 and 2 looking at how Christ is our life, and that Christ, it's not just that he transforms us for the sake of being able to go to heaven someday. He actually comes into our life and he transforms us. The Holy Spirit takes up residence in us, and then he is transforming us, present tense, all the way through until we get to heaven. And he's not just doing it like with the whip, you know, you better do this, you better do this. But he actually empowers us. He gives us the ability to transform as we go along. And so in seeing all this stuff, he's not just giving us a model, but he's given us the power and the ability. Because he's not just Christ our life in general. He actually wants to be your life today. And so in this last few weeks, we looked at husbands and wives 2 weeks ago. We looked at how Christ actually should affect the relationship between husbands and wives. And then last week we looked at how does Christ affect the relationship between parents and kids. How does this work out? And so how do we bring the gospel, how do we bring Christ into the relationships that we have between husband and wife and parents and kids? And so this week we're looking at how do you bring Christ into the relationship between those in authority and those who are under authority. Now I want to go back a little bit and remind you that when Paul is writing this letter to the church at Colossae, which is why it's called Colossians, it was a city in what is now Turkey. It was a city back then in the Roman Empire. And so this was a real group of people, a church just like this. I'm sure they didn't have a building like this. Probably didn't have amp issues like this church did this week. But when you look at it, it was a real church with real people. But here's the thing. In the church, you had husbands and wives. You had parents and children. And you also had slaves and masters. So this would have been in this particular church building. Now also on top of the church building, or not on top of it, but also in the church building, you have these homes. And so the relationship that Paul is talking about here is when he's dealing with these three categories, husbands and wives, parents and children, slaves and masters. This is the home. This is the relationship of the home, because slaves lived with their masters in the home. And so the purpose was, how do we create a home that is attractive to a watching world? The way in which you do that, you create a home that is attractive, is by letting Christ affect husbands and wives, parents and children, slaves and masters, because it was all a part of the home environment. Well, the things he said were revolutionary, obviously, to husbands and wives, but they were supposed to always treat their parents or spouses that way. But it was specifically revolutionary for the husband. It was also revolutionary kind of for the parents and the kids, even though dads were always supposed to treat their kids that way. But remember the power that the dad had. Remember the power that the husband had. But it's not real hard to imagine the power that the master had. And so when Paul says, I'm going to teach you, I'm going to help you understand how you are to be wives and husbands, children and parents, slaves and masters. Now, we look today, and I know there is the modern-day slave movement that is certainly prevalent in our society today with sex trafficking and all that stuff. And it exists. I mean, from what we've heard, it exists right here in Byron Center. But by and large, when we talk about slavery, when we talk about this, we recognize that this is not something that is socially acceptable today. But when we talk about those who are in authority and those who are under authority, that is something that we can very much relate to. But the best way to be able to describe it that I understand is the idea of your job, your work relationships. But just know, this could affect, because some of you are retired. Guess what? You still have a boss. You still have a boss. That's right. It could be your spouse. Okay? Especially if you're men. So it could be your spouse. It could also be your volunteer leader here at Frontline Bible Church. Maybe you're a Sunday school teacher. You're retired, but you're a Sunday school teacher. Therefore, you're under authority. It could be somebody that you like I said, you volunteer at a place for it. It could be anywhere that you are under authority. That is your situation. So think to your relationships. It's not just your boss, but wherever you are under authority or wherever you are in authority. And that's what I want you to see here as we go through it. So even though I say let Christ control your work relationships, which is really the theme of this message, it's really let Christ control those relationships in which there is authority which is present. And so the question is, how do you handle that? So I want us to look at Colossians chapter 3, 1 through 4. Colossians chapter 3, 1 through 4. This is setting the stage for this. Since then, you have been raised with Christ. Set your hearts on things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. That is where you are. Because you are in Christ, you are seated at the right hand of the Father in Christ. I know that's hard to imagine, but that's where you are, the real you. That's where you are, even though we are living down here. And because of that, we are to set our minds on things above, not on earthly things. In other words, when you think about relationships of authority, are you thinking with a horizontal perspective, or are you thinking with a vertical perspective? Are you thinking as if this world is all that I know, or are you thinking that based on my relationship with God, how am I supposed to treat those who I'm under authority to, or those who I have authority over? in relationship to to Christ. For you died, and your life is now hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is your life, appears, then you also will appear with him in glory. In other words, the natural man, the things that I want to do as somebody who's under authority, or the things that I want to do as someone who has authority, needs to be realized. I need to realize that the natural part of me is something that's dead. It's gone. That part was cut out of me, and now the life of Christ lives in me. So when I go to my relationships as under authority or in authority, I need to have a new perspective, which is the Christ perspective. And so let me ask you this. When is the last time you put your Christ perspective and you took him to work? How do you act to your boss? How do you act to your employees? How do you act to those under authority or that you're in authority over? How do you act? Do you bring Christ out? And so today, I want to encourage you today, which is a little bit different than how I would normally have preached this message. I would have normally preached this message as, you need to do this. You need to be like this. And I would be doing it with a lot of my fingers pointing right back at me. John, you need to do this. John, you need to do this. But going through this series has really helped me understand something, which is, me, I don't want to do this. Even though I may have authority in situations, I don't want to be this way all the time, because John Lowder is definitely not perfect. And in the places where I'm under authority, I don't always want to act this way because I'm just John. And so I have to realize that even though Christ is saying this is the expectations, he's not saying this is the expectation, now get to work. What he's saying is, let me have control of you. Because if I take control of you, I will change you so that you will do these things. I'm not going to just give you the job and say, get to work, and I'm going to punish you if you don't do it. I'm going to give you not just the responsibility, but I'm going to give you the power to be able to do it as well. And so with that as our backdrop, let's read our section here. Verse 22, chapter 3. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord Christ you are serving. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there is no favoritism. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. So why should we do this? Because I believe that Christ offers these benefits. There are benefits that Christ offers as we surrender. Just as there were benefits to the husband and the wife, just as there were benefits to the parents and the children, there are also benefits to the employer-employee, or those who are in authority, those who are under authority. And so here's the first benefit. I believe Christ changes your focus. He changes your focus when it comes to the relationships of authority from giving. He brings it to giving instead of getting. It becomes about giving and not getting. And so when you look at this, I'll ask you this question. Whether you are a boss or an employee, we'll just leave those terms and you refer to everything else. Understand it from the other things we talked about. I'll ask you this. Is the focus of your job to get something from your employer or employee, or to give something to them? I'll ask it again. Is your focus to get something from them, or is your focus to give something to them? Now, we get that from the perspective of you're the slave, okay? Let's put it back in their terms. All right, so I'm a slave in the house. It is my job to make them happy and do all the work and do all the things they want me to do. That's my job. I need to give something to them. But in actuality, and a lot of times, oftentimes, even those of us who are under authority, I may give you something to really get something. I give you hard work so that you give me a pat on the back. I give you my commitment to showing up on time so that I don't get in trouble. I give you this so that I get that. And so it becomes almost this trading that we do. I give you this in order to get that. I give you this in order to get that. Paul says, okay, here's the thing. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. Period. No other way of looking at it. If there's something that they want you to do, you do it. Now, when do you do it? Well, he says, do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. Two things. Not only when their eye is on you. What does that envision in your mind? When they're watching, right? Boss is coming. Straighten up. You ever felt that or maybe heard that at work? Or maybe you're the one that says it. Oh, boss is coming. Get to work. Look like you're working. Quick, close out of those tabs on the computer. Whatever else. Okay, I know I was just buying airline tickets, but quick, close out of that. I got to get back to work here. Not because the boss is around. But when the boss is not around, well, what do? Slough off, do whatever else. So not just with your eye on where the boss is, but also one of the things is, do you have your eye on the clock? How many of you have a natural timer that goes off in your head with about 15 minutes left to go from work? The clock goes off and all of a sudden you're thinking to yourself, oh my goodness, well, let's see, time to close off of everything. It's going to take about 15 minutes to do all this. I want to make sure because the second, you're struggle to get into work on time. But man, when the clock says you're done, you have no problem getting out of work at time, right? How many of you can relate to that at all? Yeah, okay. So this is the thing. And so when Paul was saying, he says, okay, slaves, I want you to make sure you obey your earthly masters and everything, not just when their eye is on you, not just with your eye on the clock, but I want you to, or to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart. That word sincerity is really what we would get our word integrity from. It's really kind of that word integrity. I'm going to ask you this. When it comes to your job, when it comes to how you perform your function, how much integrity do you show? Let's go back to, let's say, an 8-hour workday. Now, it's called an 8-hour work day for a reason. It's not an 8-hour show-up day, 5-hour work day. You see what I'm saying there? So let me ask you this. How much integrity do you show when it comes to your job in terms of, if you're paid to work, are you working? That's, I think, what Paul is getting at here. He's saying, guys, okay, listen, if you want to show the gospel, if you want to show what really the Christian life is all about, then let's think of what God is asking of us, but also what is He empowering us to do. And frankly, here's the thing. There are some bosses that I've had over the years that I have no problem working hard for. And then there are others I didn't want to work hard for. Some of those that I didn't want to work hard for, they basically, you felt like you were just unimportant, expendable. Maybe even they reminded you of that often. I could fire you and just get somebody else. Maybe you've heard those words. How much does that make you want to work hard for them? Boy, I'll tell you, when I think back to even some of the slaves and slave owners, I'll bet you there was more than one slave out there who said, I really don't want to do this. And if I weren't your property, I would not be doing this. Some of you feel like property because of the paycheck, because of whatever else. We live in a society where you can leave. Here's the thing, though. I think for a lot of us, we want to leave because we feel entitled to a lot of things. We feel entitled to accolades. We feel entitled to more money. We feel entitled to this. And so we get into this entitlement mentality and we take it to work. Rather than having the mindset of, wow, I get to have a job. Wow, God gave me the ability to even do this job. There are people, and who knows where else in the world, that they would kill to have a job like I have, and I get to do it. But instead, I have a mindset of I'm going to go to my job to get something. And even though I was motivated last week based on this paycheck, I'm not motivated anymore. So I'm going to give them 7/8 of the work because I know that I'm due another eighth worth of money. Have you ever had those thoughts creep into your head? Have you ever known somebody around? You see, I think that's what Paul is addressing when it comes to how does Christ change this? Christ didn't come to get. He came to give. What would change in your job if you went to work with the mindset of, I'm here to give my best to this company? I'm going to trust that God's going to see this. I'm going to trust this, but I'm here to give my best. And whether the boss is watching or not, whether he gives me the pats on the back or not, I'm here to give my best. You see, that's a focus, and when you show up to work, it changes the way you work. There's a verse in 1 Peter chapter 5. I'll just read it for the sake of time, but you can write it in your notes if you want to. But 1 Peter 5, 5 and 6. All of you, it says, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. Because God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Maybe you've heard that phrase before. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand that he may lift you up in due time. Now, here's the thing. If you're a slave, you get that, right? I'm here to give. Okay, all right, I can kind of get that. I'm here to give. All right, slave owner, are you here to give? Because it goes on to say, masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair. I don't have to give my slave anything. He's my property. I bought this slave. I can do what I want with this slave. And Paul says, hey, listen. You need to provide your slave with what is right and fair. You need to provide your employee with what is right and fair. Why? Because then he goes on. Because you know that you also have a master in heaven. You know that you have a master in heaven. So every one of us is under authority. And so the question is, am I giving or am I getting? Is that my focus? So that's the first one. Are you going to work to give your best? Second one is this, attitude. The second thing, Christ changes your attitude. Instead of it being about it becomes more about letting go rather than about holding on. It's about letting go and not holding on. Here's the thing, holding grudges is a killer for all relationships. It's a killer for all relationships. You ever been in a situation at work where you had a beef with your boss or a beef with your employee, and if those things are not dealt with, they can just fester and fester and fester, and that's really what, unfortunately, was going on. How does your attitude affect your job performance? My boss is good, so I do good. I got a bad boss, so I don't do good. I like my job, things are good. I don't like my job, things are not so good. There's a thing that you have in your computer. You ever seen that before? Usually up in the upper left corner of your screen, maybe when you log in, it's the very top thing. And oftentimes what happens is when you delete something, if you want to delete a file on your computer, you will delete it and it goes into your recycle bin. It's interesting that it's called recycle, but anyway, it goes in the recycle bin and it stays there until you go, unless you have it set up automatically, but you go and you hit the delete button. I want to empty my recycle bin. Why do we not empty the recycle bin? For fear that if I get rid of it, I may need that again. And so I put it in the recycle bin and I keep it there because I may need it again, which is why even as I look on my email box, I don't know about you, how many pieces of email are in your trash box of your email account? I just looked this morning. I have 33,000 emails in my trash. And those are the ones that are unread. I know some of you are questioning my organization. Trust me, you should. I get it. But for a lot of us, the reason why I don't empty that is because I think to myself, I may need a file out of there. I may need an old email, and I can go and research it. Here's the thing. For some of you, though, this is how what's affected your boss or your employees. You have items that have been in your past, and you think to yourself, I'm going to keep track of that one because I may need that one someday. I may need to remember that my boss did that to me because, man, I'll use that one against him at some point in time. If we go back, and it's like this whole thing of Christ changes your attitude. It's about letting go. It's not about holding on. And so Paul here is saying, he says, do it with sincerity of heart. Do it with reverence for the Lord. Whatever you do, work at it with all your heart. If there are pieces of your heart that are distracted by something that is hanging out over here, your boss said something, your employee said something, if there's something that still has a place in your heart, if you remember earlier on, Christ talked about doing things with compassion, humility, gentleness, forgiveness. You see, I'll bet you if you prayed and you said, God, I got this beef at work, and me and my boss, we're not seeing eye to eye on stuff. God, please show me the things that you want me to deal with. I'll bet you anything he's going to show you. And then the responsibility is going to be, what are you going to do with this? How are you going to actually be able to get to a place again where you have true sincerity of heart? I am doing this because I let this go. I'm not holding on to these things. I'll give you a great example. Colossians chapter 4, verse 9, if you want to look over there. Talking about a guy by the name of Tychicus, verse 7, because he's bringing this letter from Paul. Paul's in prison, by the way, in Rome right now. And so he sends this guy Tychicus along with this other guy by the name of Onesimus. And so verse 9, he says, he is coming with Onesimus, our faithful and dear brother, who is one of you. They will tell you everything that is happening here. And we go, oh, just cool name, Onesimus, cool guy, all right. You know there's a whole book in the Bible about this guy Onesimus? That whole book of the Bible is the book of Philemon. You see, Philemon went to the Colossian church. Philemon was a slave owner. Onesimus was his runaway slave. Onesimus was a part of the church. He had been there, probably sat in the same aisle or whatever. Now, there's a church out in Virginia. My dad was telling me about it. A church in Virginia that the main floor, because this was from back in pre-Civil War, the main floor was for all the regular people and the slave owners. And then all the slaves would sit up in the balcony. They weren't allowed to sit on the main floor with the family, but they would sit up in the balcony for those slave owners who brought their slaves to church. So we don't exactly know. Did Onesimus come with Philemon, holding hands, we're going together to church, and they would sit down next to each other? Probably not. But they would have been in the same building for a time until Onesimus beats feet, gets out of Dodge. He heads to Rome. Well, it's there in Rome that he meets this guy by the name of Paul, the Apostle Paul. And Paul and Onesimus strike up a relationship. Isn't it interesting? Onesimus' name means useful. Ironic, isn't it, right? This useful slave runs away, goes to Rome, and while there, he meets Paul, comes to know Christ, and his life is transformed. And so you can just picture the day when Tychicus and Paul walk in to church, or who knows, and he walks back in and he says, hey, boss, I'm back. And Onesimus is looking at him like, what am I supposed to do with you now? Paul writes the letter of Philemon for Onesimus to give to Paul to say, Philemon, the things that he owes you, put it on my account. This is a dear, faithful brother. Do you think that Philemon may have had a conversation or two with his wife about what he's going to do if he ever gets his hands on this Onesimus guy? As I'm looking and I'm thinking that as soon as I see this Onesimus guy, I'm going to get that guy. And what does Paul tell a guy like Philemon? here in this church. Masters, provide your slaves with what is right and fair, because you know that you also have a master in heaven. In other words, if you were a runaway before God, how would you want God to treat you? Oh, boy, I would sure hope that God would be understanding. I sure hope that he would maybe offer some forgiveness to me. You know, Philemon, maybe you should do the same thing. You see, the word was, if you're an employer, how would you want to be treated if you were the employee? If you're an employee, okay, here's the thing. You need to do what is right, but you need to trust that God's going to take care of you. But it's about letting go. It's not about holding on. And we see that really with the example of Christ. And so, really, as we get to this last one, Christ changes not only your focus, he changes not only your attitude, because this is something that I can't do. I can't make myself focus on those sort of things, because frankly, I want what's going to get me ahead, not just going to get others ahead. Christ changes that. He changes my attitude so I can let these things go, so I can really just keep focused on God and what he's done for me. But then the last one is he changes my actions. And I came up with these words: prepayment, not repayment. Prepayment, not repayment. As I said earlier, for a lot of us, we look at church, or we look at work relationships as something that I'm repaying. So I got my paycheck, and I think my paycheck is pretty good. Therefore, I'm going to work hard at my job. I didn't really like my paycheck. I think it's not enough for the amount of work that I have to do. Therefore, I'm going to give the amount of work that I think I'm actually being paid for, which is maybe 60% of my efforts. So I'm repaying the company for what they give to me instead of the other way, in which it is about payment ahead. Prepayment. Work hard. Why? And this is what we see. Whatever you do, verse 23, work at it with all your heart, as working for the Lord, not for men. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward, it is the Lord Christ you are serving. This gives us the reason to do it for good. I'll give an example of this. I've shared this story before, but it really has stuck with me quite a bit. There was a gentleman who worked for just a manufacturing company, and he did these things called armatures. And if you've ever seen electric motors and you've seen the copper wiring that goes on the inside, what it is the electricity comes and it spins that copper because of the current and everything that's going through there. I don't understand all of it. I just know that's kind of how it goes. So he ran a machine that wound this copper around those things. And if you've ever looked inside of a motor, you realize there's a lot of copper. There's a lot of wires inside there in these motors. So he ran the machine day in, day out, day in, day out, and he ran the machine. And one day he came to his church service and he heard a sermon about doing your best. This particular verse, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men. And so here's what he said. He said, I'm going to go to work and I'm going to do my job for the glory of God. No matter what happens around me, I'm going to do it. I'm going to do my best for this. And so he set out on a mission. He says, I want to be the best armature wirer that this company has ever seen. And so he'd come into work and he'd study his machine. He'd try to figure out how could he get a little more speed out of the machine without killing the machine while still being able to do it right. He was constantly looking at this. Well, here's the thing. The company, the brass, as they say, took notice. And they see this guy as he's out there and he's trying to be the best that he can be. And so they're looking at this armature wirer guy and he says, he's up to something. Let's try to figure out what's going on. So they had this guy next to him that worked. Didn't like the guy. He was a slough off. You know, one of those guys that shows up to work and doesn't work the whole day, constantly looking for breaks, everything like this. So this guy, he's there right next to him. And so the big brass come one day in front of the guy and they say, we would like to promote you to be the boss. Well, this guy he's setting the company records, whatever else. He looks over at this guy. How does he respond? Well, sure, I'm doing all this stuff, busting my butt to make all this for the company, and what do? Nope. Instead, what does he do? He keeps seeking to be the best armature wire that he can be, because that was his mission. I want to be the best armature wire this company's ever seen. So this guy gets elevated. He gets promoted. They take notice again. What's going on with this guy? And so one day, they haul him into the office. And they said, "Sir, what's going on? Why in the world do you do this? Because we promoted the guy around you, it didn't change you one bit. Why do you do this?" His response, "Because the Bible tells me, whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord and not for men. And I made it my mission to be the best armature wire that I can be, no matter what." And they said, "We see that. In light of that, we want you to be the plant manager." You see, the difference was, when you look at this situation, you have Paul, who's explaining to the slave, don't worry about what they're saying. Don't worry about what they're doing. Don't worry about all that stuff. You focus on your job. You prepay it. I will repay. I will handle this. I will be the one to work at it, okay? You don't have to be the one to worry about it. And so as we go through, he says, okay, this is the good. Since you know that you will receive an inheritance from the Lord as a reward. It is the Lord Christ you are serving. You're not serving your boss. You're serving me. Anyone who does wrong will be repaid for his wrong, and there is no favoritism. In other words, if you do right, I will reward you. If you don't do right and you don't do it right, don't sit there and go, oh, because I'm a Christian, I have a Christian boss, I can slough off. No, I don't care whether you're a slave or whether you're the boss. God says, I can handle you just fine. If you're a slave, you're an employer. If you're an employee, you're an employer. God says, you have a responsibility, and that is, you treat people the way they should be treated and let me handle the rest, which is why it's prepayment, not repayment. And so the question is, I'll ask you, before going into work, what's your attitude? What's your focus? What are you prepared to act on? That's the thing. Problem is we can't do this. I don't know about you, but I can't do it. I was evaluating even my own life and even looking here. There are days I have a lot of time here by myself. There's nobody watching, even though there's security cameras everywhere. But they don't really know. You guys don't know what I do in my time. Maybe you have a job like that. Maybe you have a job in which you have a lot of autonomy. I have to look in my own life and I have to ask myself, am I being a faithful servant to Frontline Bible Church? Am I working hard? And I have to tell you, there are some days where I'm not. Whether it's because I'm tired, whether it's because I'm distracted. And yet there are other days where it's I'll tell you, I had no problem whatsoever. I love my job. In fact, just this morning, I'm like, I love being a part of this church. I love doing what I do. But on the good days where it's easy to work hard, are you working hard? But what about on the bad days? What about on the days where it's not? Are you truly saying, Christ, I need you for this? Which is why the closing challenge is the same as it's been each week. Because I heard from some of you. In fact, I just had a good conversation this past week of somebody who attends Frontline who took this thing to work and made it up on a little sign and put it up on the wall that says, Lord, please, I'm going to stop saying, Lord, please help me do this, and I'm going to start saying, Lord, I can't. I'm telling you, if you're having a hard time being a good employee, just tell God that. Lord, stop saying, Lord, please help me to be a good employee. He knows you're not a good employee. He knows that. Saying, God, I need you. I want to be the best fill in the blank that I can be for your glory. And I'm going to trust that by doing my best, you're going to reward me. You're going to notice. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm going to trust that you have this. I'm surrendering control of trying to manage all this. I'm surrendering it to you, saying, God, you can have me. I will actively trust you. And so where you're at right now, are you ready for this? Whether it's in the husbands and wives, parents and kids, employee, employer, whatever it is, are you ready to let Christ truly have control of your life? He can change it. He can change it. Let's all stand as we close in prayer this morning. God, as I think about this morning, as I think about your word, you have come into our lives not just to save us so we can go to heaven someday. You have come into our life so that we can truly have life. We can have freedom. We can have hope. But even, God, as I think about the sermon today, you have come into our lives that we can actually have productive, fulfilling, life-giving work relationships. Man, I know that there are people that are probably here. They have unsaved co-workers. And they're wondering, how in the world can I reach my unsaved co-worker? Boy, what would it say to the co-workers if they finally started living their faith out? What would it say to the boss that they've been trying to talk to? If they didn't just work when the boss's eye was on them, they worked hard. They gave their best. They had integrity at work. Lord, I pray that you would be the one that would transform us, that you would make us so that we are ready to represent you wherever we go. You have our lives. We surrender to you. So God, thank you for giving us the freedom to work hard for you and for others. In Jesus' name we pray. And all those in agreement said, amen.